Welcome, everybody, to the Always Hope podcast, the show that provides solutions to a better life. My name is Dr. Mario Sacasa, licensed marriage and family therapist, and grateful that you're joining me for another amazing episode. Well, here we are, the second part of my Advent series. If you haven't been able to listen to the first part, please go ahead and check that one out because we talk about acceptance and acceptance's role here at this time of this season. Here we are at the end of the year, reflecting on what has been and starting to think about what will be. And acceptance is a key to helping us to be able to find healing and understanding about what has happened and allowing us to have some sense of freedom as we move forward in life. What I want with this series is to really be reflecting on how Advent is a season of healing and a season of hope. How really, as we begin to reflect and to think and to allow into our imagination the Christ child, the coming of Jesus, well, what we come to see is that this is really a tremendous miracle. I mean, that's like an understatement to say that, but to recognize that God meets us in our loneliness, that God approaches us, that God comes to us. And that's what I want to focus on today is the surprising way that God approaches us, the surprising way that God meets us in our circumstances. I said this in the last episode, but the reason that we celebrate Christmas during this time of the year is because it's the darkest time of the year. December 21st is literally the shortest day of the year for us in the Northern Hemisphere. Again, what is this calling into our imagination? It's reminding us that in the darkness, Christ comes. What I want to use for a vehicle to be able to explain this a little bit more accurately about how Christ comes to us in a surprising way in our lives is to offer a reflection on the movie It's a Wonderful Life. If I had enough bandwidth and could do another podcast, it would absolutely be a movie podcast. I love movies. I love watching movies. I love talking about movies. I love being able to share great stories with friends, with family. I love being able to watch movies on my own. I mean, I love a good movie, and I love being able to go to the theater and to watch a good movie in the company of people who get it also. All of the above, I absolutely love movies. A few years ago, when I was sick with COVID and had long COVID, it was right around this time of the year. And during my time with long COVID, I just binge watched every single Christmas movie that there was. I mean, you named it. I watched It's a Wonderful Life, which we're going to talk about. I watched Elf. I watched Home Alone. I watched The Christmas Story. I watched Die Hard, which is a Christmas movie, in case you didn't realize that. And I binged all of these movies. And so I have a little bit of a ranking here for what I think are my top three. But we'll save that maybe for another episode. But I want to be able to just focus on It's a Wonderful Life and why, in my estimation, it is the greatest of all Christmas movies. The reason that I think It's a Wonderful Life stands above all the other movies is because, man, Jimmy Stewart is just unbelievable. And the guy is a hero. I didn't realize that he was a brigadier general and fought in World War II and asked for no special treatment just because he was a celebrity. I mean, just an amazing, amazing person and human being. But in this movie, I think it's his quintessential role. He just nails the part of George Bailey. George Bailey is us, isn't he? I mean, like, even you watch this movie now, however many years later, when that movie came out, 40 something or another. So what are we, almost 80 years after that movie came out? Still, it's a classic story. Why? Because George Bailey is us. He is the person who is striving to do what's right under any circumstance. He is us in the sense that life approaches us, life befalls us, it challenges us, it convicts us. And what do we do? What do we choose in that moment? And what you get throughout the story as it continues is that every dream, every desire that George seems to have, it almost feels like there's like a conspiracy working against him. It's like this conspiracy working against his happiness. And if we are honest with ourselves, I imagine that maybe have had moments like this, where that thing that we've been praying for hasn't come to fruition, where the thing that we thought we were moving towards didn't quite work out the way that we had expected. That we feel like there's almost this agenda against us, that God is against us, or we're almost wrestling with God for our happiness and our desires. George experiences this throughout the movie. And I believe that it's something that all of us can absolutely connect with. So for the same reasons that I absolutely love Spider-Man 2 and why that's my favorite superhero movie, the themes of responsibility and choice play out tremendously within this movie. George, of course, has this desire to want to go to college, to want to travel the world, to want to get out of Bedford Falls, but everything continues to pull him back. His desires for wanting to go travel the world and to go to college weren't rooted in selfishness. It was just that this is who he is. This is the type of guy he is. He's got these grand schemes, these grand desires, and he wants to go tackle them. But at the same time, he's also confronted with the realities of his dad dying and his brother wanting to go to college also, and all the other circumstances that befall him as the movie continues. That again, what we're seeing is George having to make choices. What's the lesson here for us? In our life, we're often going to be confronted with moments where we have to make decisions. Life has a way of force ranking our values and whatever it is that we long for. And suffering has a way of being able to start sifting through those desires and through those longings. And that's what I believe that the Lord does in our lives during times of suffering, is that it allows us to be able to start thinking through, well, which of my values, which of my desires are genuinely from God? And what are desires that maybe I've been holding too hard onto? Expectations that I've placed against myself and on others. What are things that need to be let go of a little bit? Here we see George confronted with this, with constantly having to choose and having to force rank. Is it what he wants, or is it what his family needs? Is it what's best for the community, or is it what is best for him? And constantly George is making the decision where he's sacrificing himself for the good of others. If we read this in a cynical lens, then we come to the conclusion that God is thwarting George's desires. Again, not so. The truth is, this is life. And this is the Father Walter Chiswick story. If you've read He Leadeth Me or With God in Russia, what you see is Father Walter having to confront the reality of his circumstances, of being sent to solitary confinement, to being sent to the gulags under a false pretense of being a Vatican spy, which was so far from the truth in his own life. How does he come to terms with those 20 plus years of wasted time, or quote unquote wasted time in Russia? It's not. Even in our experiences of our suffering, if we are trying to fast forward and move on to the next thing, if we're trying to just stuff this and get through to the other side, then we create more problems. This is part of what I talked about in my last episode on ACT. That ACT is communicating or saying that if we can just come to a place of acceptance about where we are and the struggles that we're having right now, we can prevent compounding that difficulty by all of those false attempts to reach for dopamine or to reach for something that's just going to be a quick little fix, or the other ways that we push people away, or all the other things that we do that exacerbate whatever the problem is. Father Walter is trying to encourage us to just find some acceptance about where we are in life and seeing that God is manifesting and present within these circumstances. This is the challenge that George faces throughout his life, as he's constantly making a sacrifice, constantly choosing the other people, constantly stuffing his own desires, constantly putting it aside, that in moments what emerges is the anger that he experiences because of this. And you see that, of course, playing out towards the end of the movie as we're getting to the crescendo of the film, when he cusses out the teacher on the phone and cusses out his kids. He doesn't cuss out his kids. But anyways, but you know, he gets really angry with them over little dumb things. That's George just feeling the weight of those decades of him making those sacrifices and not properly grieving within his own heart the desires that were lost. My dear brothers and sisters, I want to encourage you that if you find yourself in a place where you're struggling like this, to be able to give yourself space to grieve the feelings of loss that's there, even as you're being forced to have to make decisions and make choice. The reason that this is important is because we start attending to our heart and attending to what is actually happening within our hearts. If we can give a spotlight to that, then we can bring the Lord into that. We can bring other people into that. But also what it does is that it helps us to reclaim a sense of agency over our life. We can't always control the circumstances that befall us. We can't know if we're going to make the right investment in plastics like George and his friend, or trying to do the building a loan to pass it off to his brother, and then his brother gets married and has an opportunity to get a higher paying job and ultimately fight in the war and become a war hero. We don't have control over all the circumstances that come to our lives, but we do absolutely have control about how we respond to them. And that means giving some space for grief to emerge, giving some space for those tender emotions, inviting people into that, bringing the Lord into that also and giving ourselves an opportunity to be able to exhale a little bit as we just acknowledge that things are hard. And just acknowledging things are hard, again, allows us to reclaim a sense of agency. And if we can reclaim a sense of agency about the hardships that we're experiencing, then we are reclaiming a sense of hope. Second point here that I want to make is how George, despite the hardships that befall him, is constantly trying to do what's right, constantly trying to choose the good over anything else. And that's difficult. We see a lot of movies now that have been coming out that give backstories to classic villains, whether it's Wicked or Maleficent, or even the Mufasa movie that's coming out now about Scar and Mufasa and their relationship. And often what you see as a thread in each one of those movies is that the villain, the classic villain, doesn't always start as a classic villain. Joker might be the exception here where it's just nihilism in its own right. But most of these movies, when they're given a backstory to a villain, it starts with the villain being a good person, and then hardships befall that person, and then the decisions that they make that ultimately lead them towards villainy. The reason that's important is because we're all capable. We're all capable of being the villains in a story. We're all capable of being able to make poor decisions when hardships befall us. George is a saint in this movie. He's the one who constantly is choosing what's right despite the hardships that are there. And he's in a battle with Potter's, particularly. Potter's like the devil. Potter's a bad guy to the very end. Even when he comes across the $8,000 from George's uncle that sets the final scene all in motion, he doesn't give it. He steals that $8,000, which is unbelievable. The guy's a villain. And that scene where George is tempted to actually join the devil's team because Potter offers him a job that basically is going to pay him something like 10 times his current salary. The temptations are there. They're all there. And George was flirting with it as he's smoking the cigar and really appreciating the goodness that was there. And then finally says, no, I'm done with this. I don't need to make a decision. I don't need to talk to my wife. I'm done. I'm not listening to you anymore. That type of firmness against the temptations of the devil is one that we have to have, especially in those moments when we're low. Because when we're low and when we're grieving or when we're vulnerable is when we're most likely to want to end up doing something that we wouldn't normally do under other circumstances. So just as George flirts a little bit, comes to terms with it and recognizes, oh, I see what's happening, and puts a firm line against it, we too are encouraged to be able to have those firm lines. See, another thing that I think is interesting in the movie is that George, even in his lowest moment when he's contemplating suicide, the reason that he's entertaining the idea of suicide is because he has convinced himself that what's best for his family is for him to die so that they can get the life insurance money, that they can claim his policy so that they can have enough finances and resources to be able to provide for themselves. That's key because, again, we know that George is a selfless person, and there even his selflessness gets twisted by his own grief and gets twisted by his own pain, that he comes to the conclusion that the best thing that I can do is sacrifice my life for my family so that they can get the life insurance. We see how the devil is a trickster and how he can use all sorts of things, even our good, in a twist it in a way in our moments of weakness to be able to convince us of something being good when it in fact isn't. In a previous episode, I talked about water as this symbol of chaos. Well, we see this symbol playing out in It's a Wonderful Life. Right at the very beginning of the movie, what happens? He's a kid. He goes into the water to do what? To rescue his brother. Saves his brother, makes the sacrifice, is now permanently deaf in his ear. First tragedy that happens. Then we see water again. When they're on the dance floor and the swimming pool is underneath the gym. And so he falls into the water with Mary. Then again, when do we see it? On their wedding day, on the honeymoon, when they're driving away, it's pouring rain. And when it's pouring rain, they trying to get out of town, but they can't. Why? Because there's a run at the bank and he has to go save the bank and use his money that he just got for his wedding that was going to be for their honeymoon. Now he has to be able to use that to save the bank. It's pouring. And then when else do we see water? Again, at the very end of the movie, when he's at his lowest point, he leaves the house, he goes to the bar, and it's just snowing. It's snowing, it's snowing, it's snowing. Again, water, water, water. And he's contemplating what? To commit suicide. How? Not by shooting himself, not by hanging himself, but by what? By jumping into the water. Again, I'm telling you guys, keep your eyes open and you're going to see that these themes are playing themselves out. So what happens as George is contemplating his life and looking at the chaos of his life, from the snow coming down to the water in the river? Grace comes. Grace comes. And grace comes in an unexpected way. Clarence, his misfit angel, jumps into the water willingly, jumps into the chaos of George's life for what? To pull George's goodness out of himself. It goes into the water to save Clarence, but Clarence ultimately does that to save George. That's the mystery. And that's what's so funny about this movie, right? When Clarence and George are finally out of the water and talking, and Clarence is explaining to George who he is, Clarence says, well, I'm your guardian angel. And George takes a look at him and says, you look like the type of guardian angel I'd get. I mean, it's just like this type of lines I freaking love. I absolutely love, because it's like, of course. Look, I'm busting my tail. I'm doing everything that I get, and I get this misfit of an angel who's the one who's going to come to protect me, right? It's just, I love it. I absolutely love it. Because I mean, that's just kind of the way that we all feel, doesn't it? I mean, there's moments where it's like, is my guardian angel just asleep right now? Is somebody here? Is somebody drunk at the wheel? Like, how did this happen in my life? And so that type of experience is something, again, I think that we all can connect with. In that scene, George is going back and forth with Clarence. But right before then, George prays. And George prays in the bar. And it's in the bar when he's at his lowest point. He's drinking, he's had too much to drink, and he makes his heartfelt prayer of, God, I am not a prayerful man. I'm not a religious man, he says, but if you are there, please help me out. And then immediately right after that, the husband of the teacher that he had chewed out in the scene before is sitting right next to him and punches him, because he's like, you made my wife cry for an hour. So he punches him. And George, with the bloody lip on the ground, looking at it, and he says, this is what I get for praying. I mean, just visceral. It's the Job story, my friends. It's the Job story in modern retelling, where it's like you keep trying, and you keep getting punched, and you keep getting punched in the face. Again, if we're honest with ourselves, we can feel that, we can resonate with that. I love this movie. I cry every single time I watch it. These are experiences that I've had tremendously within my own life. And I'm grateful that there's movies and art like this that reminds me that grace will come and meet me. Grace will come and meet me. So Clarence comes and emerges as this quirky angel and does this experiment of giving George a vision of what Bedford Falls would be like without him. And it's in this vision where George is capable of seeing all the good that he has accomplished within his life and able to see the ways that he's impacted other people. So few of us get opportunities like that, where we can actually see the ways that we've impacted others. But George is given a gift, and the gift is for him to be able to see that. Now, the one part of the movie that's probably the most dated of any other part of the movie is that in the crescendo of his vision is when he sees Mary coming out of the library as an old maid. And he's like, she's an old maid. He's probably like 35, 37. He's not 40, maybe 40, 37. And she's a couple years, she's 4 years younger than him. So let's say George Max is like 40. She's 36 at the oldest. And he's crying that she's an old maid. You know, it's like, that's the part of the movie might be a little dated. That's okay. All right. We'll go with it. We'll do what we can. We'll accept it all that we can. Right. So, but that's the moment where George is like, oh, I got to go back, because I got to, basically, he just recognizes the good that he's accomplished within his life. So when he comes back, the vision's over. He's back in Bedford Falls, not in Pottersville anymore. He's still bleeding. The snow is still coming down, and he runs home and just absolutely declaring joy all along the way. Even when he comes in and the police officers are there ready to arrest him because of the $8,000 that's missing, George is still elated. Why? Because he's finally come back to touch the reality of his life and the goodness that is there. And he stops seeing his life just through the negative lens that has been painted for him. That negativity bias has taken over in those last scenes. And finally, he's able to reclaim and see the goodness that's there. And regardless of what happens, he rejoices in it. And then the movie ends with the triumphant scene where there's the second run The first run of the bank was everybody's trying to take money away from the building alone. The second run is at the end of the movie where everybody's coming to bring money to George, where it's finally that return in investment, the community, the people that he's been sacrificing for, the people he's been giving towards in his lowest moment finally come back and repay the favor in tenfold, 100-fold, whatever it is. And it's just, absolutely beautiful, 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 beautiful. That, again, it's a movie, it has a happy ending. We don't always get the happy ending. We don't always get to see the ways things all play out. But we can, if we just give ourselves a little bit of grace, if we can open our eyes to see how grace manifests within our lives. Even in those low moments, if we can open ourselves up to community, open up to friends, open up to loved ones, open up to others that we may be struggling, inviting others to be able to meet us in our pain, to meet us in our vulnerability, to meet us in our moment of loneliness. That if we can open up to friends, to loved ones, if we can pray and see how God manifests in our lives in surprising ways, even with misfit angels who feigned suicide to save us, we'll come to start recognizing that the work that we do, the good that we put into this world is not in vain. And that ultimately is the answer that we want to every single one of our longings. Is the sacrifice that I'm making worth it, Lord? Is the pain that I'm experiencing right now, is it worth it? And that's a question of meaning that we all have to wrestle with. It's the question that George Bailey comes to answer at the end of the movie. It's the question that Father Walter Chiswick answers in his time in the gulags. And it's a question that all of us have to be able to come to as well. God is alive in our midst. That's what we celebrate this Christmas season. That in the darkest moments, the Christ child comes. And we celebrate that not as some event that just happened 2,000 years ago, but as some event that is happening here and now. God, where are you? God, how are you coming to me? God, help me to see you operating within our midst. God, help me to let go of whatever expectations that I've placed upon myself. God, help me to let go and surrender whatever vain ambitions that I have that are preventing me from being able to experience and see your goodness in the midst of my life. God, help me to find meaning and purpose in the midst of the suffering that I'm experiencing. God, help me to have hope and belief in your grace and your goodness, that you're not just doing this as some eternal vivisector. You're not just cutting me up for the sake of it, as C.S. Lewis says, but rather that you are a surgeon and that you're delicate, that you're trying to cut and remove parts of me that need to be removed, things inside of me that need to die a hard death. Let them die, Lord, so that I can grow and that what has been pruned can come to new life, that a new version of me, Lord, can emerge in the midst of this. George Bailey is that phoenix who rises from the ashes. And my encouragement to all of us is to be able to take courage and to see that and to recognize that, believe in God's goodness, and let that be your prayer for the rest of this Advent season. See how God is still operating within your life, even if you don't fully see it. We are not omniscient. We are not omnipotent. We can't see all things, but God is here. God is present. God is with us. And let us celebrate that today. So thank you guys so much for joining me for another episode of the show. Look forward to having you back next week as we continue on this Advent season of hope and healing and being able to find new ways that we can continue to claim God's goodness in the midst of the darkness of our lives.